They ignored the woman in row 9, just a crumpled hoodie, quiet, almost invisible. Then the nightmare began. The plane didn't just shake, it bucked, alarms shrieking, lights flashing blood red as the cabin plummeted. Amidst the terrifying chaos, a voice crackled over the intercom. Desperate, laced with a plea for salvation, the pilot whispered her call sign. "Shadow Link 7, if you can still hear us, the cockpit is waiting." Who was this passenger? Dismissed by everyone, yet known by the captain in their darkest hour. This is the harrowing story of a flight teetering on the edge of oblivion and the hidden hero in seat 9A. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Veteran Biker for more untold stories. The muted hum of the Boeing 747 was a familiar lullaby for seasoned travelers, a steady, rhythmic drone promising distant lands and new beginnings. For Eleanor, nestled in seat 9A, it was simply the backdrop to her quiet existence. She was a study in anonymity, loose black hair, pulled carelessly into a low ponytail, framed a face almost hidden by thin-rimmed glasses. Her wrinkled hoodie, a size or two too large, swallowed her frame, and a small, worn fabric bag was clutched tightly in her lap, its contents unknown, its significance only hers to bear. She wasn't just blending in, she was disappearing, an ordinary passenger among hundreds, unremarkable in every way. The first tremor was subtle, a mere shiver through the fuselage, easily dismissed as standard turbulence. A few murmurs rippled through the cabin, quickly settling back into the quiet drone of the engines and the rustle of magazines. But Eleanor knew better. Her gaze, steady and intense, flicked to the small, almost imperceptible dip of the cabin pressure gauge. It was too soon, too sharp for mere air pockets. "Is the pressure dropping?" she quietly inquired, her voice a low murmur, barely audible above the rising hum. Brenda, the flight attendant with tightly curled blonde hair and a strange smile, paused by her row. Brenda was good at her job, professional, always ready with a practiced reassurance. But today, the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ma'am, please stay seated," Brenda replied, her voice saccharine, a practiced calm that felt brittle. "Let the professionals handle it." The words were polite, but the underlying tone was clear. "Stay in your lane, passenger." A nearby passenger, a woman in a bright pink cardigan dripping with fake sweetness, scoffed loud enough for Eleanor to hear. She probably thinks she's a secret pilot or something. Always one in every flight. Her husband, bald and red-faced, snickered, his eyes flicking over Eleanor's faded jeans and peeling sneakers with undisguised disdain. "Yeah, no offense," he drawled, "but you don't exactly look like you belong up front." Eleanor didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on her worn bag, her gaze unwavering, fixed on something unseen, perhaps an internal calculation, a silent ticking clock only she could hear. She adjusted her glasses with a slow, deliberate motion, a gesture that spoke volumes about her composure amidst the brewing discontent. The plane shuddered again, a violent, guttural groan that vibrated through the floorboards and up through the seats. This wasn't turbulence anymore. This was a beast thrashing. Overhead lights flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that danced with the growing unease in the cabin. A low buzz of panic rippled through the passengers, a collective intake of breath. The facade of calm began to crack. Then the horror truly began. Without warning, the plane didn't just shake, it bucked, pitching violently forward as if struck by an invisible fist. A collective gasp, then a horrifying, drawn-out shriek filled the cabin as the floor dropped out from beneath them. The plane wasn't merely experiencing turbulence, it was plummeting, a metal bird surrendering to gravity, falling straight down into the churning black abyss of the storm below. Alarms blared, a piercing, incessant wail that assaulted the ears, drowning out the rising crescendo of screams. The cabin lights, which moments before had merely flickered, now pulsed a stark, urgent red, painting every terrified face in a demonic glow. Oxygen masks, like silent plastic jellyfish, dropped haphazardly from the overhead compartments, dangling uselessly in the shaking air as panic-stricken passengers fumbled with them, their hands trembling too violently to secure them properly. A child's terrified wail cut through the cacophony, a raw, innocent sound that amplified the terror. People gasped for air, clutching armrests, their eyes darting frantically to the windows where clouds churned like a monstrous storm devouring more. The deep groan rumbling through the cabin was no longer just a sound. It felt like the very structure of the plane might split apart, tearing open to the unforgiving sky. Amidst this terrifying chaos, a figure remained eerily still in row 9. Eleanor. Her movements were minimal, almost imperceptible. While others screamed, clutched, and cried, she sat unyielding, her thin-rimmed glasses catching the pulsing red light, her hands still steady on that worn bag. Her silence was not that of shock or paralysis. It was a profound, unsettling stillness that spoke of an inner world far removed from the surrounding pandemonium. It was the silence of a predator, or perhaps a guardian, observing, assessing, waiting. A man in a polo shirt, his face flushed with irritation and fear, struggled to stand, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. "Hey, you! Stop acting like you know something. You're freaking out my kid." His wife tugged at his sleeve, pleading with him, but he shook her off, his voice rising hysterically. "I'm not sitting here while some random in a hoodie plays pilot." His words were raw, fueled by fear and prejudice, an accusation hurled at the calmest person in the cabin. Eleanor's hands tightened on her bag for just a second, a fleeting flicker of tension before she relaxed them again. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a moment, a gaze steady and unyielding, devoid of anger, full of an almost preternatural calm, before looking back out the window where the sky was a mess of grey and black, churning like a cosmic maelstrom. She seemed to be searching for something, a pattern, a solution, in the very heart of the storm. The guy in the tracksuit snorted, leaning closer to Eleanor, his voice dripping with mockery. "What, you going to fix the weather too? Chill out, hoodie girl." His buddy chimed in, louder now, trying to incite more laughter. "Bet she's one of those conspiracy nuts. Probably thinks the plane's haunted or some crap." A few passengers, desperate for any distraction from their terror, offered weak, sharp laughs, the sound cutting through the hum of the engines like broken glass. Eleanor ignored them all. Her focus was absolute. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small, dog-eared notebook. She flipped it open, her fingers tracing a page, not reading, just touching, a tactile anchor in a world spiraling out of control. It seemed to ground her, connect her to something beyond the terrifying present. The woman in the pink cardigan, seeing the notebook, rolled her eyes. "Oh great, she's got a diary. Maybe she's writing her big hero speech." The sarcasm was thick, a desperate attempt to regain some control by belittling another. But then, through a haze of static that filled every speaker, the captain's voice suddenly broke over the intercom. It was strained, laced with a raw desperation that stripped away all pretense of professional calm. His words were not for the passengers, not for the flight attendants. They were for one person, a last desperate plea into the void. "Shadow Link 7, if you can still hear us, the cockpit is waiting." The plane lurched again, a violent, sickening roll that threw passengers against their seatbelts. A deep groan rumbled through the cabin, sounding less like a malfunction and more like the entire structure might split apart, swallowed whole by the storm. It was the sound of impending doom, amplified by the silent, unsettling anticipation that now filled the space between each shudder. The call sign hung in the air, a cryptic whisper of hope in the suffocating terror, a secret known only to a select few, and now to the unseen woman in row 9. Eleanor's eyes flickered, just for a moment, a subtle recognition that went unnoticed by the panicked crowd. She knew that call, she knew it well, and the weight of it, the gravity of what it meant for her to be called, settled over her like a heavy shroud. The captain's desperate plea, Shadow Link 7. If you can still hear us, the cockpit is waiting, sliced through the cabin's growing hysteria, a chilling counterpoint to the wailing alarms. The words hung heavy in the air, a cryptic lifeline offered to an unknown entity. Passengers, their faces contorted with terror, glanced around, searching for a sign, a hero, anyone who might respond to such an enigmatic call. Yet, the woman in 9A remained Eleanor, an unassuming figure, her gaze still fixed on the churning chaos outside, her silence more profound than ever. The silence wasn't born of shock, but of focus, a deep-seated concentration that seemed to draw all the ambient noise into a singular, internal hum. She wasn't just hearing the captain's voice, she was processing it, weighing the implications, the desperate trust woven into that single whispered call sign. Brenda, the flight attendant, her professionalism now strained to its breaking point, moved with a jerky urgency through the aisle. Her forced smile had long since vanished, replaced by a pinched expression of profound worry that etched lines around her mouth. She clutched a clipboard to her chest like a shield, her blonde curls, once so neat, now slightly disheveled. Her eyes, wide with a fear she fought to suppress, scanned the cabin for any flicker of hope. She stopped at Eleanor's row, her voice, usually so composed, now sharp with the raw edge of panic. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. You're making people nervous with that talk," Brenda insisted, gesturing vaguely to Eleanor's earlier, seemingly mundane question about cabin pressure. It was a misplaced accusation, a desperate attempt to assert control over the uncontrollable, to find a scapegoat for the terror that was gripping everyone. Brenda, like many others, found Eleanor's unyielding composure unsettling, almost unnatural, preferring the familiar comfort of shared panic. Eleanor looked up, her face a mask, utterly blank, yet her eyes behind the thin-rimmed glasses were steady, unblinking pools of resolute calm. "I'm not the one shaking the plane," she stated, her voice surprisingly low, a quiet pronouncement of undeniable fact, not an invitation to an argument. There was no aggression, no defiance, just an unvarnished truth that momentarily stunned Brenda. The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard by the sheer, unassailable logic of the reply, then spun away, muttering under her breath about passengers who think they're experts. A middle-aged woman, in a bright pink cardigan, who had been listening intently, leaned forward from across the aisle. Her voice dripped with fake sweetness, a thin veneer over a core of simmering resentment. "Honey, you're meddling too much. Just let the crew do their job. Nobody needs a wannabe hero in row 9. Her husband, bald and red-faced, nodded vigorously, his eyes raking over Eleanor's faded jeans and peeling sneakers with undisguised contempt. "Yeah, no offense," he drawled, the words laced with plenty of it, "but you don't exactly look like you belong up front." His gaze conveyed a clear message. "You don't fit the picture of competence. You don't fit in here." The entire row, indeed, a good portion of the cabin, was staring now. Whispers rippled like an unsettling current, some passengers not even bothering to hide their snickers. The judgment was palpable. A suffocating blanket of dismissal draped over Eleanor, who remained impassive. She merely adjusted her glasses, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if counting to 10 in her head, or perhaps counting down the precious seconds being wasted on human folly. The plane shuddered again, a more violent, sickening jolt than before, and a child a few rows back burst into fresh, piercing sobs. The overhead lights flickered frantically, plunging the cabin into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life, intensifying the low buzz of panic that now threatened to erupt into full-blown hysteria. The doors to the cockpit, usually an impenetrable barrier of authority and security, suddenly swung open. The CO pilot, Marcus, stepped out. He was tall, with a no-nonsense buzz cut, and his jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might crack under the immense strain. His eyes, sharp and desperate, scanned the terrified faces in the cabin, searching, pleading for something, anything. "We need someone with navigation training," he announced, his voice low but carrying over the din, raw with urgency. "Anyone with military experience, even basic, please identify yourself." The cabin fell into an abrupt, eerie quiet, broken only by the incessant hum of the engines and the faint, heart-breaking sobs of the child in the back. Hope, a fragile, fleeting thing, flickered in the eyes of the passengers. Then Brenda, hesitant, almost reluctantly, pointed a trembling finger at Eleanor. She mentioned cabin depressurization earlier, in row 9. The words were hesitant, tinged with a palpable discomfort, as if she were reluctantly exposing a strange, unusual secret she barely understood herself. A woman with a sleek bob and dazzling diamond earrings, draped in a designer blazer, leaned out of her seat, her voice sharp and accusatory, slicing through the brief silence like a honed blade. "You're trusting her? She doesn't even look like she can afford this flight." The words were dripping with disdain, a venomous judgment based purely on appearance. The laughter that followed was colder, more biting than before, a chorus of cruel snickers that turned the cabin into an impromptu courtroom, Eleanor on trial for the crime of not looking the part. The air thickened with prejudice, suffocating Eleanor under its collective weight. Yet she did not flinch, did not react. She had faced far worse trials than this. Eleanor stood, her movements were fluid, unhurried, as if the plane were perfectly stable, as if the very fabric of reality wasn't tearing itself apart around them. Her worn fabric bag, still clutched, was now slung casually over her shoulder. She began to walk toward the cockpit, her peeling sneakers silent on the carpeted aisle, each step deliberate, unhurried. Marcus, the CO pilot, watched her with a mixture of desperate hope and profound bewilderment, offering a quick, almost imperceptible nod. But the woman with the diamond earrings wasn't finished. "This is a mistake," she hissed, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, fueled by a self-righteous conviction that bordered on hysteria. "You're putting us all at risk for some nobody." Her words were meant to be a final, damning judgment, to halt Eleanor in her tracks, to rally the collective fear against this unconventional savior. Eleanor paused just for a second, her hand resting lightly on the back of a seat for a fleeting moment, then continued walking, her steps steady, unshaken, a silent rebuke to the woman's prejudice. She moved with an inherent grace, a quiet power that seemed to ripple beneath her humble exterior. The judgment, the whispers, the fear, they were mere background noise to her. She was already elsewhere, mentally preparing for the task ahead, a task that transcended the petty concerns of social status and outward appearance. Marcus's eyes remained locked on Eleanor, who had now reached the entrance to the cockpit. He walked over, his boots heavy on the carpet, the sound of his footsteps a stark punctuation in the cabin's strained silence. "Ma'am, have you studied aviation before?" he asked, his voice low, tinged with an almost hesitant hope, as if he still couldn't quite reconcile her appearance with the desperate need. Eleanor looked up, her gaze meeting his. It was steady, almost unnervingly calm, a depth of focus that belied her unassuming facade. "Altitude's drifting by 4 degrees, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, a direct technical assessment that instantly cut through the haze of panic and doubt. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who already knew the answer, who was already one step ahead. Marcus's mouth opened, then closed, a flicker of bewildered recognition crossing his face. He nodded, just once. A tiny, almost involuntary movement, as if he didn't quite know what to make of her, or perhaps didn't want to show the full extent of his surprise. The implication of her question, the immediate, accurate technical observation, resonated with him on a deeper level than any resume ever could. "Come with me," he said, turning sharply toward the cockpit, the words a quiet surrender to the unexpected. Eleanor started down the aisle again, her sneakers silent, her bag bouncing lightly against her hip, a small rhythmic motion that belied the monumental task ahead. That's when the suited executive, Mr. Sterling, stood up. He was in his 50s, impeccably dressed with slicked back hair and a watch that screamed money, a symbol of his perceived authority and influence. "Hold on!" he barked, his voice accustomed to being obeyed, stepping into the aisle to physically block Eleanor's path. "You can't let someone like her in there. Look at her. She looks homeless." His voice was loud, booming with outrage and indignation, designed to draw every eye in the cabin, to rally the fearful against this perceived threat to their safety. The plane shook again, a deep, terrifying rumble that made the overhead bins rattle ominously, but Mr. Sterling didn't budge. "This is a serious situation. You need a professional, not some nobody in a hoodie." A few passengers, their faces tight with fear and judgment, nodded in agreement, their prejudice outweighing their desperate need for salvation. They were more comfortable clinging to appearances than embracing an unconventional solution. Brenda, the flight attendant, stepped forward, her voice firm but shaky, caught between her duty and the overwhelming pressure from the passengers. "Sir, she's been cleared. She's assisting with technical support." Mr. Sterling's face twisted like he'd bitten into something sour. "Technical support? Her? You're joking!" His contempt was absolute, his disbelief a tangible force. Eleanor stopped, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the floor. She looked at him, her eyes steady, piercing, not angry, just intensely present, seeing through him, through his fear, through his superficiality. Her voice, when it came, was so calm it sent a chill through the already frigid air, a quiet pronouncement that was more devastating than any shout. "You just lost 2 minutes due to prejudice," she stated. Her words slow, deliberate, each syllable landing with the weight of an unassailable truth. "That's long enough to lose a wing." Mr. Sterling froze, his mouth half open, like he'd been slapped. The blunt, brutal honesty of her statement, coupled with its chilling implication, silenced him completely. Eleanor stepped past him, her bag brushing his arm in a fleeting contact, a physical embodiment of her quiet defiance, and continued walking toward the cockpit. Her steps remained steady, unwavering, leaving behind a silence far heavier than the plane's shaking, filled with the echoes of his own folly. The prejudice, the judgment, the doubt, they were all secondary to the ticking clock that only she seemed to hear. Every second was precious, and they had just squandered 120 of them on fear and baseless assumptions. The real battle, she knew, was about to begin, and it wasn't just against the storm. It was against the very human nature that had almost doomed them all. Eleanor walked. Each step was a quiet assertion against the plane's violent shuddering, her peeling sneakers making no sound on the carpeted aisle, a stark contrast to the cacophony of alarms and terrified screams behind her. The cockpit door, a symbol of rigid authority and desperate hope, loomed ahead. Its polished surface reflected the cabin's chaotic flashing lights, a distorted mirror of imminent disaster. She pushed it open with a calm, decisive motion, stepping into a world where every flicker of light, every blip on a screen, held the overwhelming weight of hundreds of lives. Inside, The cockpit was a whirlwind of urgent, yet almost desperate activity. The space, normally an ordered sanctuary of control, felt tight and claustrophobic, now bathed in the eerie, pulsing red glow of emergency instrument panels. The captain, a man whose face was slick with cold sweat, was hunched over the primary controls, his knuckles white, gripping the yoke with a death grip. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darted frantically between the array of defiant dials and the churning blackness outside, a picture of a seasoned pilot battling a beast far beyond his current capabilities. He was pushing the limits of his training, his experience, and his very will against an unseen, unforgiving force. He glanced up as Eleanor entered, his gaze briefly meeting hers, a fleeting moment of bewildered recognition of a name unspoken before his focus snapped back to the terrifyingly plummeting altitude. He had fought too long, seen too much of the approaching abyss, to spare more than a fleeting second for this unexpected, almost surreal intrusion. Eleanor didn't wait for an invitation, didn't need one. Her presence in that sacred space was not a request. It was an imperative, a direct, undeniable response to a desperate summons that had echoed through the plane. She moved with an innate sense of purpose, her body language radiating an authority that belied her unassuming attire, a quiet power that spoke of vast, unseen capabilities. Her eyes, sharp, analytical, and remarkably calm, swept across the complex console, absorbing the chaotic symphony of flashing warnings, erratic readings, and the deep, bone-rattling vibrations that permeated the entire aircraft. Her mind, a whirlwind of calculations, was already piecing together the fractured data, discerning the truth behind the chaos. Shadowlink 7 requesting Keo navigation clearance, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it sliced through the insistent hum of the instruments and the strained, labored breathing of the crew like a honed blade. The call sign, whispered with such quiet confidence, resonated with an almost mythical quality in the tight confines of the cockpit, a name that carried a weight of legend and untold stories. It wasn't a question, nor a plea, nor a polite request. It was a statement of profound intention, a reassertion of a dormant yet powerful identity. The captain, his entire being coiled in the monumental struggle against the plane's violent, uncontrolled descent, froze. His head snapped up, his eyes widening in a mixture of disbelief and stark terror, as if he had just witnessed a ghost materialize before him in the swirling chaos of the cockpit. His hand, trembling visibly, involuntarily pointed to the CO pilot's vacant seat, the one Marcus had just vacated moments before. His mouth worked, words failing him, struggling to form coherently before a fragmented sentence, raw with astonishment and a chilling realization, finally broke free. "Oh my God, only one person ever used that code," he choked out, his voice hoarse, thick with a mix of awe and dread, the kind of visceral reaction reserved only for legends or spectres stepping out of the shadows. His gaze was fixed on Eleanor, searching for confirmation, for understanding, for a past that had abruptly, impossibly, crashed into his terrifying present. Shadowlink 7. "We thought you disappeared after the Nevada incident." The name, Nevada Incident, hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken history, with classified missions, whispered rumors, and untold sacrifices. It was a shadowy operation, cloaked in layers of official secrecy, rumored to have pushed the boundaries of aviation, a mission that had seemingly consumed its most brilliant and enigmatic operative. For a fleeting moment, a barely perceptible flicker of something unreadable, a memory, a burden, a ghost of her past, crossed Eleanor's otherwise impassive face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, subsumed by the overwhelming immediate urgency of the present crisis. There was no time for lingering shadows, no room for personal history, no space for the echoes of what once was. The hundreds of lives trembling on the precipice of oblivion demanded her absolute focus, her entire being. "There's no time," Eleanor stated, her voice firm, cutting through the captain's disbelief and his lingering questions. She didn't offer explanations, didn't confirm or deny the whispered rumors of her past, didn't dwell on the mention of the Nevada incident. The only thing that mattered, the absolute priority, was the immediate, terrifying threat looming over them. She slid into the CO pilot's seat, her movement fluid, practiced, as if the cockpit were a second home, a place she had inhabited countless times before, a natural extension of her own will. Her hands, long accustomed to the intricate dance of controls, moved with an almost instinctive grace, a silent symphony of expertise. She leaned forward, her fingers brushing the radar screen, her eyes sharp and analytical, scanning the array of digital readouts with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the layers of malfunction. "Your pitch control system is feeding false readings," she declared, her voice devoid of judgment, merely stating a critical, undeniable fact. Her tone conveyed the authority of absolute knowledge, leaving no room for doubt. She pointed to a specific section of the screen, her finger precise, unwavering, highlighting the terrifying discrepancy. "Actual altitude warning is 800 feet higher than shown." The captain stared, his face a mask of dawning horror. His mouth worked, as if he wanted to argue, to challenge her instantaneous, startlingly accurate diagnosis, to cling to the familiar, comforting but now fatally flawed readings of his own instruments, but no words came. His eyes flickered wildly between Eleanor's calm, resolute face and the terrifyingly incorrect altitude display on his own panel. The implication was staggering, gut-wrenching. The plane was far lower, far closer to the unforgiving, jagged terrain than their instruments suggested. They were flying blind, not by a mere margin of error, but by a catastrophic miscalculation that was actively leading them to their doom. He nodded once, a short, sharp jerk of his head, a gesture of bewildered capitulation, a silent admission of her undeniable competence. He didn't know what to make of this mysterious woman, this Shadow Link 7, but he knew deep in his gut that she was right. Eleanor's hands moved to the secondary controls, a blur of motion, a testament to her unparalleled skill. She began recalibrating with a dizzying speed that didn't match her faded jeans or peeling sneakers. A speed that belonged to a different world, a different kind of pilot, forged in the crucible of elite operations. She was bypassing, overriding, re-establishing a true, uncorrupted connection with the air around them, with the fundamental, brutal physics of flight. Every adjustment was deliberate, precise, a fluid extension of her will, a silent testament to years of ingrained high-stakes training and an almost symbiotic relationship with complex life-saving machinery. She was dissecting the problem, identifying the core failure, and already weaving a path back from the brink. A harsh crackle suddenly split the tense silence over the radio, the voice of a backup crew from the airline, sharp, authoritative, and filled with a rigid adherence to protocol, cutting through the cockpit's strained atmosphere. "No passengers are to handle controls. That's an order. Repeat, no passengers." The voice was rigid, unyielding, a bureaucratic command attempting to impose order on a chaotic reality, an order that was now tantamount to a death sentence. The captain hesitated, his hand hovering over the mic, caught in an agonizing internal conflict between the rigid protocol he had sworn to uphold and the undeniable, desperate reality unfolding before him. He knew the rules, the severe, career-ending, potentially criminal consequences of allowing an unauthorized person, especially one with a scrubbed record, to touch the controls of a commercial airliner. But he also knew with a horrifying, gut-wrenching certainty that strict adherence to those rules now meant certain, immediate death for every single soul on board. It was a choice between procedure and survival. Before he could respond, before he could voice his agonizing dilemma, another voice, gruff and unyielding, erupted through the main cabin speakers, echoing into the cockpit with chilling clarity. It was the voice of a security officer from air traffic control, his authority absolute, his tone laced with suspicion and contempt. "I don't authorize someone scrubbed from defense systems to touch anything. That's a direct violation. Stand down now!" The words were a direct attack, a public condemnation of Eleanor's shadowy past, a cold clinical judgment hurled across miles of airwaves designed to strip her of any legitimacy, any hope of intervention. The very mention of scrubbed from defense systems carried a heavy weight of dishonor, of a career ended in disgrace, implying a breach of trust, a fundamental flaw that rendered her unfit. Eleanor paused. Her fingers, which had been dancing over the controls with almost mechanical precision, stilled. She didn't flinch, didn't betray any emotion, her face remaining utterly calm, a mask of unyielding resolve. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet the captain's eyes. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, holding his, conveying a silent question, an ultimate choice. "Then start calling rescue," she said, her voice soft, clear and steady as a heartbeat, cutting through the escalating tension like a surgical scalpel. "To retrieve everyone's bodies." The captain's face paled further, the implication of her words hitting him with brutal force. It wasn't a threat, it was a cold, hard, unavoidable fact. His hand still hovered over the mic, trembling, torn. But then Marcus, the CO pilot, stepped forward, his own jaw clenched, his eyes now fixed on Eleanor with a newfound desperate conviction. His voice, when it came, was firm, resolute, cutting through the radio static and the security officer's protests. "I'll sign off," Marcus declared, his words ringing with defiance against the unseen authority on the other end of the line. "Let her take over. I'm taking full responsibility." It was a momentous decision, an act of professional suicide, a leap of faith born of desperation, and an undeniable trust in the enigmatic woman before them. He knew the ramifications, the inevitable investigations, the potential ruin of his career, but faced with certain death, the choice was clear. Eleanor pulled up the CO pilot's seat, slipping on the headset with a practiced ease that made the captain's hands still, his internal struggle momentarily suspended in awe. She didn't smile, didn't hesitate, didn't offer a single word of acknowledgement. Her focus was absolute, her movements fluid and purposeful. She adjusted the controls with a precision that felt almost mechanical, her fingers dancing over the buttons and dials like a maestro conducting a symphony. Outside, the storm clouds loomed, dark and heavy, a monstrous churning wall of grey and black, but Eleanor's focus was solely on the screens, her hands moving like they'd done this 1,000 times before, like they were born to the task. The cabin lights flickered again, but now a flicker of true hope, faint yet undeniable, began to stir in the desperate heart of the storm. The cockpit, moments ago a chamber of barely contained chaos, now transformed under Eleanor's touch into a crucible of controlled precision. Her hands, long, lean and utterly steady, danced over the complex array of controls with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the violent jerks and plunges of the aircraft. She didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess. Every movement was deliberate. Every adjustment a calculated strike against the encroaching disaster. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking behind her thin-rimmed glasses, flicked with impossible speed between the malfunctioning primary displays, the ominous readings of the altimeter, and the churning blackness of the storm outside. The captain, still slick with sweat, watched her with a raw, almost childlike awe. his earlier fear replaced by a bewildered reverence. He muttered under his breath, "She's handling this like it's a combat zone." Eleanor's eyes flicked to him for just a second, a brief, unreadable glance, before returning to the controls, her silence louder than any response. The storm outside was a monstrous living entity. Dark, heavy clouds loomed, a churning wall of grey and black that seemed to swallow the very light of the world. Rain lashed against the cockpit windows, streaking across the glass like angry tears, blurring the already terrifying view. Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating brief, terrifying glimpses of jagged, unforgiving mountain peaks that materialized and vanished like specters in the tempest. This wasn't just a flight through bad weather, it was a desperate battle for survival against nature's unleashed fury, exacerbated by the insidious treachery of failing systems. Eleanor's focus was absolute, a singular point of calm in the heart of the storm. Her breath was even, her movements economical. She wasn't just flying the plane, she was dissecting its pain, understanding its fractured signals, coaxing it back from the brink of collapse. Her fingers brushed against a small, unmarked switch on the lower console, an old, almost forgotten piece of technology. It was an Echo Wave terrain navigation system, a relic from a bygone era of aviation, something most modern pilots hadn't touched in years, if they even knew of its existence. Its dusty, worn surface suggested disuse, yet Eleanor activated it without a moment's hesitation, as if it were the most natural choice in the world. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy monochrome outline of the terrain below. It was crude, primitive compared to the advanced digital displays, but it was honest. "It's the only system not lying to us right now," she stated, her voice calm, utterly devoid of triumph or fear. A faint, insistent beep sounded from the control panel, a subtle anomaly that Eleanor immediately honed in on. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer, her fingers adjusting a dial with meticulous precision. Her movements so precise they seemed almost choreographed, a silent dance of expertise. The captain's hands twitched above his own controls, a primal urge to intervene, to take back the reins, but he stayed silent, mesmerized, watching as the altitude numbers on the Echo Wave stabilized, then slowly, agonizingly, began to correct themselves against the false readings of the primary system. The plane dipped, not violently, but with a smooth, deliberate drop, a controlled descent that defied the chaos outside. It was a sensation utterly different from the uncontrolled plummet they had experienced moments before. The shaking, which had threatened to tear the aircraft apart, began to subside, gradually, hesitantly, as if the plane itself was sighing in relief. The cabin pressure gauge, a silent arbiter of their fate, crept back to normal, its needle settling into the green. One by one, the warning lights on the main panel blinked out, extinguished by Eleanor's steady hand, replaced by the reassuring, steady glow of operational systems. Eleanor didn't pause. With the plane now under her command, she adjusted the altitude again, threading the massive aircraft through a narrow, almost invisible gap in the churning storm clouds. The mountains, jagged and unforgiving, slipped by below like dark, silent giants, their peaks shrouded in mist, a stark reminder of the peril they had narrowly avoided. It was a maneuver of breathtaking audacity, a feat of piloting that defied the conventional wisdom of flying in such conditions. Marcus, the CO pilot, leaned forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound disbelief. "How did you know to do that?" he breathed, his voice barely a whisper, echoing the unspoken question in the captain's mind. It wasn't just the technical skill, it was the intuitive understanding, the almost prescient knowledge of what the plane needed, what the storm demanded. Eleanor didn't answer. Her hands remained on the controls, her face unreadable, a study in focused intensity. Her past, her training, the experiences that had forged her into Shadowlink 7 remained her own. It was a silent, almost sacred commitment to the present task. As she made a minute adjustment, a faint scar, barely visible, ran along her left wrist, disappearing under the sleeve of her hoodie. It was an old scar, deeply etched, a silent testament to a wound, a sacrifice, a forgotten battle. It was in this moment, as Eleanor guided the behemoth through the eye of the storm, as the last vestiges of panic in the cockpit began to recede, that Marcus, still leaning forward, his gaze fixed on Eleanor's focused profile, caught sight of something else. Not just the scar on her wrist, but a small, almost imperceptible symbol, faintly tattooed just below the hem of her sleeve. A stylized, almost abstract image of a burning phoenix, half obscured, its form suggesting a relentless, defiant rise from ashes. His eyes widened further, a flicker of profound recognition, then a dawning horror washed over his face. He knew that symbol. It wasn't just a military tattoo, it was the unofficial emblem of a highly classified, now disbanded, Black Ops unit. And more, it was inextricably linked to the truth behind the Nevada incident. He drew a sharp, involuntary breath, the revelation hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "The mark of the Maverick," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a guttural sound of shock and a dawning understanding. He leaned in closer, his voice urgent, trembling with the weight of the realization. "You were not just scrubbed from defense systems, were you? You were the one who exposed the corruption that caused the Nevada incident." The words hung in the air, a shocking revelation that ripped through the lingering tension in the cockpit. The captain, though still focused on the controls, visibly stiffened. The Nevada incident wasn't just a classified mission that went wrong. It was a scandal, a cover-up, a blight on the very institutions Eleanor was now saving. The implication was staggering. Eleanor wasn't a disgraced pilot. She was a whistleblower, a hero who had dared to stand against systemic corruption, paying the ultimate price by being scrubbed and erased from official records. Her disappearance wasn't punishment for failure, but retaliation for truth. The calm, unassuming woman in the hoodie wasn't just skilled, she was courageous beyond measure, a beacon of integrity in a world that had betrayed her. Eleanor's fingers paused just for a second, a nearly imperceptible hesitation, before she adjusted another control, her focus never wavering from the screens. Her silence was her answer, a confirmation louder than any words, a testament to the fact that her past, her sacrifice, was not something she dwelled on, not something she boasted about. The mission, saving these lives, was all that mattered now. The plane dipped again, a smooth, deliberate drop, and this time the shaking stopped completely. The cabin pressure gauge crept steadily back to normal, its needle unwavering. The remaining warning lights, stubborn symbols of the crisis, blinked out one by one, surrendering to Eleanor's command. Outside, the storm clouds, though still dark, seemed to part for a moment, revealing a sliver of clear sky, a promise of light beyond the darkness. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, a fleeting hint of a grim satisfaction, like she was seeing something no one else could, a path to safety forged by her own will. A flight attendant, not Brenda, but a younger one named Sarah, with a shaky voice and wide, fearful eyes, stepped hesitantly into the cockpit, her hands clutching a clipboard. The fear in the cabin was still palpable, though the worst of the turbulence had passed. "Ma'am," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, "the passengers are asking who you are. They're scared, they're confused. They saw you come in here." Eleanor didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the controls, her hands performing the intricate ballet of a pilot bringing a crippled plane back to life. Her voice, when she spoke, was even devoid of emotion, like she was ordering coffee, utterly detached from the unfolding drama behind her. "Tell them to buckle up and stay calm," she said. "We're stable." Prepare for a controlled descent. Sarah hesitated, then nodded, backing out of the cockpit, bewildered by the woman's composure. As the door clicked shut behind her, the captain, his voice still low, almost reverent, muttered to Marcus, "She just pulled off a move only taught in war zone training manuals. Echo wave maneuvers. I haven't seen that since the classified reports after Nevada." Eleanor's hands didn't falter, but her shoulders tensed just for a moment, a barely perceptible tightening, like a distant memory had brushed too close, a ghost from the past refusing to be fully confined. The captain's words, intended as awe, were also a painful reminder of the price she had paid for her integrity. Back in the cabin, the mood was still sour, a mix of lingering fear and simmering resentment. Mr. Sterling, the executive, was back in his seat, muttering to the hedge fund type next to him, his face pale, his composure shattered. "If she messes this up, who's taking the blame?" He snapped, loud enough for half the plane to hear, desperately seeking someone, anyone, to hold accountable if things went wrong. The hedge fund guy nodded, his voice oily with suspicion. "Exactly. Nobody even knows who she is. What if she's some hacker or something?" He was trying to rationalize his own fear, to justify his earlier prejudice. A woman in a designer blazer, her hair pulled into a tight bun, chimed in from across the aisle, her voice sharp with what she believed was insider knowledge. "I heard she's been scrubbed from defense systems, probably court-martialed or worse. You don't just disappear from those records for no reason." The whispers of Eleanor's disgraced past, carefully orchestrated by those she had exposed, continued to spread, painting her as a pariah, but amidst the cynicism, a flicker of fragile hope began to emerge. A young mother, clutching her toddler, looked toward the cockpit door, her eyes wide with fear, but also something else, a burgeoning hope. She whispered to the woman next to her, "What if she's the only one who can save us?" The woman, older, with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, shook her head, clinging to her skepticism. "Don't be naive. She's just a passenger. Look at her clothes." The mother's face fell slightly, but she kept her eyes glued to the cockpit door, her arms tightening around her child, a silent prayer forming in her heart. The toddler, oblivious to the drama, reached out, dropping a small toy plane on the floor. As the mother bent to pick it up, her eyes caught Eleanor's bag, still on her empty seat, a small faded patch barely visible with the letters SL7 stitched into it, a silent, almost forgotten emblem, the tiny detail, a hidden call sign, a quiet promise of an unseen hero, waiting. And then Eleanor's voice came over the intercom again, steady, clear, devoid of the earlier static, filling the cabin with a quiet authority that commanded attention. "This is Passenger 9A. Prepare for a controlled descent. Stay seated." The cabin went utterly silent, every head turning toward the speakers, hanging on every word. The security officer's jaw tightened, but he sank back into his seat, his protests silenced by the undeniable reality of the plane's newfound stability. Marcus's voice followed, clipped and professional, adding legitimacy to Eleanor's command. "I'm signing off on her actions. She's taking over." A murmur rippled through the cabin, some shocked, others angry, but many for the first time filled with a fragile, desperate hope. The woman in the pink cardigan whispered to her husband, her voice laced with disbelief. "They're letting her fly the plane? Her?" But the fact remained, the plane was stable and the descent had begun. The judgment lingered, but survival had become the undeniable priority. In the cockpit, Eleanor's hands remained perfectly steady on the controls, a testament to her unwavering concentration. Her eyes flickered between the now stabilized screens and the cockpit window, where the Kamchatka Mountains, once looming like jagged, unforgiving specters of doom, were slowly receding into the distance. The storm, though still raging around them, no longer felt like an adversary intent on their destruction, but a challenge Eleanor was systematically conquering, thread by thread, through sheer will and unparalleled skill. The hum of the engines, once a strained moan of distress, now settled into a steady, powerful thrum, a reassuring pulse that spoke of regained control. She reached for a final switch, her fingers brushing the old Echo Wave terrain navigation system, the very relic that had become their lifeline. She had trusted it when all else failed, when the modern systems with their sophisticated glitches had lied. The grainy outline of the terrain below, once a desperate hope, was now a clear, guiding map. The captain, still watching her with a mixture of awe and bewilderment, hovered over his own controls, his hands twitching like he wasn't sure whether to trust his own senses or the miraculous woman beside him. "You're using Echo Wave?" he asked, his voice tight, laced with a professional curiosity that barely masked his astonishment. "I haven't seen one of these active since my training simulations in the early 90s. He knew the system's reputation. It was robust, immune to the kind of digital interference plaguing their current flight, but it required an almost intuitive understanding of raw data, a skill rarely seen in modern pilots. Eleanor didn't look at him. Her focus was absolute, her gaze fixed on the precise trajectory she was carving through the storm. "It's the only system not lying to us right now," she stated, her voice calm, utterly devoid of triumph. A faint, rhythmic beep sounded from the control panel, a subtle anomaly that Eleanor immediately honed in on. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer, her fingers adjusting a dial with meticulous precision, her movements so precise they seemed almost choreographed, a silent dance of expertise. The captain's hands twitched like he wanted to intervene, but he stayed silent, mesmerized, watching as the altitude numbers on the Echo Wave stabilized, then slowly, agonizingly began to correct themselves against the false readings of the primary system. The plane dipped, not violently, but with a smooth, deliberate drop, a controlled descent that defied the chaos outside. It was a sensation utterly different from the uncontrolled plummet they had experienced moments before. The shaking which had threatened to tear the aircraft apart began to subside gradually, hesitantly, as if the plane itself was sighing in relief. The cabin pressure gauge, a silent arbiter of their fate, crept back to normal, its needle settling into the green. One by one, the warning lights on the main panel blinked out, extinguished by Eleanor's steady hand, replaced by the reassuring steady glow of operational systems. Eleanor didn't pause. With the plane now firmly under her command, she adjusted the altitude again, meticulously threading the massive aircraft through a narrow, almost invisible gap in the churning storm clouds. The mountains, jagged and unforgiving, slipped by below like dark, silent giants, their peaks shrouded in mist, a stark reminder of the peril they had just miraculously avoided. It was a maneuver of breathtaking audacity, a feat of piloting that defied the conventional wisdom of flying in such conditions, a path forged by a mind that saw beyond the impossible. Marcus, the CO pilot, leaned forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound disbelief. "How did you know to do that?" he breathed, his voice barely a whisper, echoing the unspoken question in the captain's mind. It wasn't just the technical skill, it was the intuitive understanding, the almost prescient knowledge of what the plane needed, what the storm demanded. It was a kind of symbiotic relationship between pilot and machine, forged in the crucible of extreme pressure. Eleanor didn't answer. Her hands remained on the controls, her face unreadable, a study in focused intensity, her past, her training, the experiences that had forged her into Shadow Link 7 remained her own. It was a silent, almost sacred commitment to the present task. As she made a minute adjustment, a faint scar, barely visible, ran along her left wrist, disappearing under the sleeve of her hoodie. It was an old scar, deeply etched, a silent testament to a wound, a sacrifice, a forgotten battle. It was in this moment, as Eleanor guided the behemoth through the eye of the storm, as the last vestiges of panic in the cockpit began to recede, that Marcus, still leaning forward, his gaze fixed on Eleanor's focused profile, caught sight of something else. Not just the scar on her wrist, but a small, almost imperceptible symbol, faintly tattooed just below the hem of her sleeve. A stylized, almost abstract image of a burning phoenix, half obscured, its form suggesting a relentless, defiant rise from ashes. His eyes widened further, a flicker of profound recognition, then a dawning horror washed over his face. He knew that symbol. It wasn't just a military tattoo, it was the unofficial emblem of a highly classified, now disbanded, Black Ops unit. And more, it was inextricably linked to the truth behind the Nevada incident. He drew a sharp, involuntary breath, the revelation hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "The mark of the Maverick," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a guttural sound of shock and a dawning understanding. He leaned in closer, his voice urgent, trembling with the weight of the realization, the pieces of a suppressed history falling into place. "You were not just scrubbed from defense systems, were you? You were the one who exposed the corruption that caused the Nevada incident." The words hung in the air, a shocking revelation that ripped through the lingering tension in the cockpit, echoing the secret battles Eleanor had fought long before this flight. The captain, though still focused on the controls, visibly stiffened, the implication of Marcus's words striking him with chilling clarity. The Nevada incident wasn't just a classified mission that went wrong. It was a scandal, a cover-up, a blight on the very institutions Eleanor was now saving. The implication was staggering. Eleanor wasn't a disgraced pilot. She was a whistleblower, a hero who had dared to stand against systemic corruption, paying the ultimate price by being scrubbed and erased from official records. Her disappearance wasn't punishment for failure, but retaliation for truth. The calm, unassuming woman in the hoodie wasn't just skilled. She was courageous beyond measure. A beacon of integrity in a world that had betrayed her. A living testament to the sacrifices made in the pursuit of justice. Eleanor's fingers paused just for a second, a nearly imperceptible hesitation, before she adjusted another control, her focus never wavering from the screens. Her silence was her answer, a confirmation louder than any words, a testament to the fact that her past, her sacrifice, was not something she dwelled on, not something she boasted about. The mission, saving these lives, was all that mattered now. The personal vindication was secondary, almost irrelevant, in the face of imminent disaster. The plane dipped again, a smooth, deliberate drop, and this time the shaking stopped completely. The cabin pressure gauge crept steadily back to normal, its needle unwavering, a symbol of their return from the brink. The remaining warning lights, stubborn symbols of the crisis, blinked out one by one, surrendering to Eleanor's command, replaced by the reassuring, steady glow of operational systems. Outside, the storm clouds, though still dark, seemed to part for a moment, revealing a sliver of clear sky, a promise of light beyond the darkness. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, a fleeting hint of a grim satisfaction, like she was seeing something no one else could, a path to safety forged by her own will. A flight attendant, not Brenda, but a younger one named Sarah with a shaky voice and wide, fearful eyes, stepped hesitantly into the cockpit, her hands clutching a clipboard. The fear in the cabin was still palpable, though the worst of the turbulence had passed, replaced by an uneasy calm. "Ma'am," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, "the passengers are asking who you are. They're They're scared. They're confused. They saw you come in here and then—" The plane stopped falling. Eleanor didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the controls, her hands performing the intricate ballet of a pilot bringing a crippled plane back to life. Her voice, when she spoke, was even, devoid of overt emotion, like she was simply ordering coffee, utterly detached from the unfolding drama behind her. "Tell them to buckle up and stay calm," she said. "We're stable. Prepare for a controlled descent." Her words were a command, an instruction, a guarantee, delivered with the quiet authority that had saved them all. Sarah hesitated, then nodded, backing out of the cockpit, bewildered by the woman's composure, by the almost alien calm she exuded. As the door clicked shut behind her, the captain, his voice still low, almost reverent, filled with a renewed sense of awe, muttered to Marcus, "She just pulled off a move only taught in war zone training manuals. Echo wave maneuvers. I haven't seen that since the classified reports after Nevada." Eleanor's hands didn't falter, but her shoulders tensed just for a moment, a barely perceptible tightening, like a distant memory had brushed too close, a ghost from the past refusing to be fully confined. The captain's words, intended as awe, were also a painful reminder of the price she had paid for her integrity, for exposing the very corruption that had marred the history of their elite forces. Back in the cabin, the mood was still a sour mix of lingering fear, simmering resentment, and grudging, bewildered relief. Mr. Sterling, the executive, was back in his seat, his face pale, his usual composure shattered, now muttering darkly to the hedge fund type next to him. "If she messes this up, who's taking the blame?" he snapped, loud enough for half the plane to hear, desperately seeking someone, anyone, to hold accountable if things went wrong, unable to accept that salvation could come from someone he had so vehemently dismissed. The hedge fund guy nodded, his voice oily with suspicion. "Exactly. Nobody even knows who she is. What if she's some hacker or something, a rogue agent?" He was trying to rationalize his own fear and prejudice, to find a convenient box to put Eleanor into. A woman in a designer blazer, her hair pulled into a tight bun, chimed in from across the aisle, her voice sharp with what she believed was insider knowledge, carefully cultivated from whispers and rumors. "I heard she's been scrubbed from defense systems, probably court-martialed or worse. You don't just disappear from those records for no reason. There must be a stain, a blemish." The whispers of Eleanor's disgraced past, carefully orchestrated by those she had exposed, continued to spread, painting her as a pariah, a threat rather than a savior. But amidst the cynicism, a flicker of fragile, burgeoning hope began to emerge. A young mother, clutching her toddler tightly, looked toward the cockpit door, her eyes wide with fear, but also something else, a burgeoning, desperate hope. She whispered to the woman next to her, "What if she's the only one who can save us?" The woman, older, with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, shook her head, clinging to her skepticism, her face etched with a lifetime of conventional wisdom. "Don't be naive. She's just a passenger. Look at her clothes. It's impossible." The mother's face fell slightly, but she kept her eyes glued to the cockpit door, her arms tightening around her child, a silent prayer forming in her heart, a tiny spark of belief defying the collective doubt. The toddler, oblivious to the drama, reached out, dropping a small toy plane on the floor. As the mother bent to pick it up, her eyes caught Eleanor's bag, still on her empty seat. A small faded patch, barely visible, with the letters SL7 stitched into it, a silent, almost forgotten emblem of the hidden hero. And then Eleanor's voice came over the intercom again, steady, clear, devoid of the earlier static, filling the cabin with a quiet authority that commanded instant attention. "This is passenger 9A. Prepare for a controlled descent. Stay seated." The cabin went utterly silent, every head turning toward the speakers, hanging on every single word. The security officer's jaw tightened, but he sank back into his seat, his protests silenced by the undeniable reality of the plane's newfound stability. Marcus's voice followed, clipped and professional, adding legitimacy to Eleanor's command, putting his career on the line for her. "I'm signing off on her actions. She's taking over." A murmur rippled through the cabin, some shocked, others angry, but many, for the first time, filled with a fragile, desperate hope. The woman in the pink cardigan whispered to her husband, her voice laced with disbelief. "They're letting her fly the plane? Her?" But the fact remained: the plane was stable, the alarming plummet had ceased, and the descent had begun. The judgment lingered, a bitter aftertaste, but survival, against all odds, had become the undeniable, breathtaking priority. In the cockpit, the tension, though no longer a raw, gut-wrenching terror, remained a palpable presence, a taut wire stretched between relief and the finality of landing. Eleanor's hands remained perfectly steady on the controls, her eyes flicking between the now reliable screens and the vast expanse of the sky beyond the cockpit window. The Kamchatka Mountains, once towering, ominous giants, were now shrinking behind them, their jagged peaks softened by distance and the breaking dawn. The storm, finally conquered, was receding, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ozone and the deep, contented hum of the engines. The air in the cockpit, once thick with sweat and fear, felt lighter, filled with an almost reverent quiet. The final descent into Tokyo was a masterclass in precision. Eleanor guided the massive aircraft with an almost ethereal touch, every mute adjustment calculated, every subtle correction absorbed by the plane's responding systems. The landing gear lowered with a faint thud, and the runway lights of Narita International Airport stretched out before them, a beacon of safety after their harrowing journey. The touchdown was so impossibly smooth, so perfectly executed, that it felt less like a landing and more like a gentle kiss between steel and asphalt. A soft, almost imperceptible bump, then the powerful whine of reverse thrusters, slowing the beast gracefully. It was as if the whole terrifying ordeal had been nothing more than a bad dream, a nightmare from which they had just awakened. Inside the cabin, the silence that followed the smooth touchdown lasted only for a breath. Then a collective cheer erupted, a raw, emotional outpouring of relief and disbelief. Some passengers clapped, tears streaming down their faces. Others embraced the strangers next to them, sobbing with sheer, unadulterated joy. The fear was gone, replaced by a wave of euphoria that swept through the rows. Eleanor's voice came over the intercom again, clear and calm, almost disarmingly casual. "We're stable, preparing for terminal taxi. Thank you for flying with us." Her words were simple, understated, a professional formality that belied the miracle she had just performed. Then the captain's voice followed, quieter, almost reverent, filled with a humility that cut through the celebratory din. "This is your captain. We owe our lives, every single one of us, to the extraordinary passenger in row 9. Her skill, her courage, saved us all." His words were not just an announcement, they were official acknowledgement, a public testament to the quiet hero. A little girl, maybe 6, with pigtails and a stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms, clapped her hands, her face lighting up with a pure, unadulterated joy. "Is she a superhero?" she asked her mom, her voice small but clear, echoing the thoughts of many. Her mom, a tired-looking woman in a denim jacket, hesitated, then smiled through her own tears. "Maybe, sweetie, she's doing something pretty amazing." The guy in the tracksuit, whose earlier snorts of derision had been so loud, offered a weaker, less certain one now, his smirk utterly gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Mr. Sterling, the executive, sat quiet, his arms crossed, staring fixedly at the floor, his face pale, his usual arrogance shattered. The woman in the designer blazer kept checking her phone, as if waiting for a signal, any external validation, to tell her what to think, unable to reconcile her prejudices with the undeniable outcome. The plane taxied slowly to the gate, the airport bustle gradually replacing the storm's fury. Passengers poured out, some still shaky, their legs weak with residual fear, others laughing with relief, eager to touch solid ground. Eleanor was one of the last to leave. Her bag was slung casually over her shoulder, her sneakers silent on the tarmac as she descended the air stair. She didn't stop to talk, didn't look for thanks, didn't seek out the admiring or repentant faces. She just walked, a solitary figure, toward the terminal, her hair swaying slightly, catching the airport lights, a ghost disappearing into the bustling anonymity of arrival. The guy in the tracksuit watched her go, his smirk now entirely gone, a look of profound bewilderment on his face. "Who the hell was that?" he muttered to his buddy, who just shook his head, equally speechless. They had witnessed a miracle, performed by someone they had so carelessly dismissed, and now she was gone. Later that day, at a press conference organized by the airline, a spokesperson stood at a podium, an artificial smile plastered on his face as cameras flashed. "We're profoundly grateful for the safe landing of Flight 472, he announced, his tie perfectly knotted, his voice smooth and practiced. "Our crew handled an unprecedented situation with the utmost professionalism and skill." A reporter cut in, her voice sharp and insistent, echoing the whispers already spreading across the internet. "Passengers say a woman from row 9 saved the plane. Who was she? Why isn't she here?" The spokesperson hesitated for just a second, his smile faltering minutely before it returned, impeccably managed. "Just a lucky passenger who stepped up," he said, his eyes avoiding direct contact with the reporters. "We don't have her name." She wished to remain anonymous. The room buzzed with skepticism, some reporters nodding, others clearly unconvinced, but the official narrative was set. Eleanor wasn't there to challenge it. She was already halfway across the airport, her bag bouncing lightly against her hip, already moving on to whatever came next. A young woman, perhaps a college student, her phone still in her hand, ran after Eleanor, having heard the whispers. "Hey, wait, can you come forward just for a moment so people can know your face, so they can thank you?" Eleanor stopped, her back to the girl for a second, then turned. Her eyes were calm, but there was something in them, something heavy, the weight of a past she carried, the burden of a truth she guarded. "They don't need my face," she said, her voice soft but firm, a quiet resolution. "They're alive. That's enough." She turned and kept walking, disappearing into the anonymous flow of the airport crowd, a shadow blending into the light, leaving the college student standing there, her phone still raised, unsure if she had just seen a person or a legend. In an airport lounge, a group of passengers from the flight gathered, their voices low but heated, dissecting the unbelievable events. The woman with the diamond earrings was there, her arms crossed, her face tight with lingering disbelief and thinly veiled resentment. "I still don't buy it," she declared, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "Anyone could have gotten lucky. She's no hero. It was just an anomaly." The older man with the patched jacket who had found Eleanor's notebook gently set it down on the table. His voice was rough but clear, cutting through the woman's cynicism. "This isn't luck," he said, his gaze steady, challenging her denial. He opened the dog-eared notebook, revealing pages filled with complex equations, handwritten coordinates, and intricate flight paths, diagrams that spoke of advanced aerodynamics and tactical maneuvers. "These are flight logs, old ones, military grade. She's flown through hell before. This woman, she's seen things, done things you and I can't even imagine." The group went quiet, the woman's diamond earrings glinting as she looked away, her carefully constructed confidence finally cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. A week later, the story had spread like wildfire. Clips from passengers' phones were all over the internet. Blurry shots of Eleanor in the cockpit, her hands on the controls, her face calm as the plane steadied. The comments were a mix of awe and disbelief. Who is this woman? She's got to be some legend. Why is she hiding? The airline stayed quiet, sticking to their lucky passenger line, their carefully crafted narrative. Mr. Sterling, the executive from the flight, was caught on camera dodging questions at his office, his face red with shame and frustration. "I didn't know," he kept saying, his pathetic excuse explaining nothing. Then came the medal ceremony. It was a small event meant for civilians who had done something truly extraordinary, a quiet acknowledgement of profound bravery. The US president stepped to the podium, his face serious but warm, his voice resonating with gratitude. "We're here to honor those who act when no one else will," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. Then he paused, looking straight at the camera. His words meant for a specific audience, a hidden hero. "Shadowlink 7, if you're watching, this country still owes you its deepest gratitude." The room went silent, every head turning, as if they expected her to walk in through the doors, to finally claim her rightful place. She didn't. The news anchors replayed the clip for days, digging into old Air Force records, finding nothing but whispers of a pilot who had vanished after a classified mission, a ghost in the machine. A passenger from the flight, a quiet man in his 30 seconds who had barely spoken during the entire ordeal, posted a video online. It was shaky, filmed from his seat, showing Eleanor's silhouette as she walked toward the cockpit, her bag slung over her shoulder, a figure of resolute purpose. "This is her," he narrated, his voice breaking with raw emotion. "She didn't care what we thought. She didn't want glory. She just saved us." The video went viral, racking up millions of views, a testament to the power of truth and genuine heroism. The comments filled with people sharing their own stories of being judged, dismissed, overlooked, finding a voice in Eleanor's quiet strength. Rachel's face was never clear, but her presence lingered like a shadow that refused to fade, a powerful symbol against prejudice. Back in Oregon, Eleanor was in a small, dusty garage, her hands covered in motor oil, a complex carburetor spread out on the workbench in front of her. The radio was on, tuned to some classic rock station, but it suddenly cut to a news break. The president's voice, solemn yet grateful, filled the room, speaking of Shadowlink 7 and the nation's debt. She didn't look up, just kept tightening a bolt, her movement steady, precise, as if her focus on the intricate machinery was a form of meditation. On her wrist, under a smear of grease, was a small, faded tattoo, SL7. It caught the light for a second, then disappeared as she wiped her hands on a rag, a silent, personal mark of a past she chose to leave behind. The guy who owned the garage, an older man with a grey beard and a slight limp, poked his head in. "You hear that, Eleanor?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "They're talking about some hero pilot again. Sounds like quite a story." She nodded, just once, her face unreadable, a faint, almost imperceptible curve to her lips. "Yeah," she said, picking up a wrench. "Sounds like quite a story." He chuckled again, oblivious to the fact that the hero he spoke of was standing right in front of him, and went back to the front. Eleanor kept working, the radio humming in the background, the world outside moving on without her, unaware of the quiet legend living amongst them. The passengers from that flight never forgot her. The little girl with the bear drew a picture of a woman in a hoodie flying a plane, her mom framing it in their living room, a daily reminder of the miracle. Mr. Sterling lost his job a month later, a quiet firing after his comments went viral, his arrogance costing him everything. The woman in the pink cardigan stopped bragging about her elite status on social media. Her last post about the flight got flooded with comments calling her out, shaming her for her prejudice. The security officer was reassigned to desk duty, his name forever tied to the incident in a way that stung, a blot on his record. None of them knew Eleanor's name, but they felt her presence every time they boarded a plane, every time they looked at the sky, a silent guardian, a profound lesson. In a small diner near the airport, a week after the flight, the young mother from the plane sat with her toddler, the toy plane still clutched in his tiny hands. She overheard a conversation at the next table, a group of pilots talking about the mystery woman who had saved Flight 472. "Nobody flies like that without training," one said, his voice low with respect. "That was combat-level piloting, a true maverick." The mother smiled, her eyes misty, and whispered to her son, "That's her, baby. That's the lady who brought us home." The toddler giggled, waving the toy plane, unaware of the weight of the moment, the depth of the gratitude. She didn't need their thanks. She didn't need their apologies. Eleanor just kept moving, her sneakers quiet on the ground, her bag slung over her shoulder, her secret safe. She'd done what she had to, like she always did. And somewhere in the back of her mind was the steady sound of a plane engine, carrying 216 people home. That was enough. It had to be. What an incredible journey, wasn't it? From the brink of disaster, saved by a quiet hero everyone dismissed. Eleanor's story reminds us that true courage often wears the most unexpected disguises, and that our snap judgments can blind us to the very people who hold the keys to our salvation. She sought no glory, no thanks, just the silent satisfaction of lives preserved. But her legacy endures, a powerful testament against prejudice and a beacon for integrity. Her actions rippled through the lives of everyone on that flight, forcing them to confront their own biases, to rethink what it truly means to be a hero. What are your thoughts on Eleanor's incredible act? Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to reveal an extraordinary strength? Share your reflections in the comments below. We love hearing from you. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to Veteran Biker for more powerful, untold tales of resilience and unexpected heroes. And don't go anywhere yet. You can continue exploring more incredible true stories appearing on your screen now. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.